Hello and welcome back to the competitive biography of Emanuel Lasker. The match between Lasker and Bird is still not over. I literally knew ahead of time how many games there would be, and I am still somewhat surprised going into this, but here we are. Let's keep it going. For this game, the players repeated the first few moves as in game 10, so Lasker opened with d4 and Bird responded with his Dutch f5, g3, knight to f6, bishop to g2, e6, and knight to f3. Now in that previous game, Bird tried knight to c6, and his move here is just as unexplored, pawn to c6. Because after Lasker castled, here Bird played bishop to e7, while the only database game I could find from before this saw bishop to d6, but this was played during one of Wilhelm Steinitz's simultaneous exhibitions from 1874. Needless to say, I don't think the players looked to this particular game for study material. Now, pretty much every other game in the database here at this point plays the move c4 and knight to c3, and then usually develops the bishop with b3 and bishop to b2. Lasker played the move knight b to d2 instead, and after Bird castled, c4 here was played in a game between Yuri Averbach and Isaac Boleslavsky back in 1951. After d5, there was this really amusing knight dance where Averbach started with knight to e5 and Boleslavsky played knight to d7. Knight back to d3, now knight to b6. This was kicked with c5, and after the knight went back to d7, here Averbach played knight to f4, hitting the e-pawn. This caused the knight to go back to b8, and after knight to f3, knight to e4, knight to e5, and Averbach would go on to win this game with the white pieces. Lasker did not play c4 in this position. He contented himself with moving the pawn only one square and put it on c3. This move is a novelty, and so it's as of move 7 that the players are playing a unique game. So to begin their adventure in this novel territory, Bird played the move d6, which is a reasonable move in itself, but Lasker plays a very pointed response in queen to c2. Now, if Lasker is allowed to break the position open with e4, he immediately gets a free attack against Bird's weak e6 pawn. So Bird has to waste a tempo preventing this by playing pawn to d5 now. Now, luckily for Bird, a single tempo doesn't really mean much because it takes Lasker quite a while to get developed. He plays rook to d1, and after Bird repeats his move of queen to e8, this knight goes back to f1. Knight to a6, and finally this bishop gets into the game on f4, and Bird once again plays his queen all the way out to h5. Now, in response to this, Lasker played a move that was very heavily criticized by his contemporaries, h4, weakening the king side. Now, this, to me, reads like one of those fabled psychological moves that Lasker would later become so infamous for. The reason behind this is that Bird currently has the match momentum with 2 consecutive wins in the previous 2 games, and this to me seems like Lasker goading him into trying for another kingside attack to try to make it 3 in a row. Now Bird doesn't yet take the bait, he instead puts his knight on the nice e4 square, and here Lasker plays the move a3, really controlling the b4 square, so that if this knight didn't go back to b8, which is what Bird played, then c4 could be played without giving up the b4 square. c4 was played by Lasker anyways. Taking this pawn always has to be checked, and here it's not recommended. If d captures on c4, white is more than allowed to take with the queen, but I think even better is to play knight to e3. If white is allowed to retake with the knight, then they're very happy, and if black tries to hold on to the pawn with b5, one very nice energetic move that white has is b3. You can sacrifice the pawn, this e-pawn remains very vulnerable, and this c-pawn is also stuck on an open file and it's blocking in black's pieces. So white would have a free initiative and very good compensation for the pawn. So instead of taking, Bird continued rerouting his knight, he put it on d7, and Lasker closed up the position with c5. Now, finally, Bird starts getting the idea to go on the attack as he plays h6, and Lasker really drives the nail in the coffin by retreating this knight back to e1. How much more backwards can you go? Now, the engine will label this move as a mistake, and we'll talk about that in a moment, but it's all a part of Lasker's plan as he successfully convinces Bird to play what is admittedly the best move in the position, g5. The attack begins, all bridges have been burned, and it's full steam ahead. We start with a trade on g5, h captures g5, h captures g5. This bishop has to move somewhere, and Lasker chooses to put it on c7. And now we can talk about how this attack should work. e5 is the main reason why this attack can succeed. Taking the pawn allows black to take on c5, and now if you play the move that Lasker was intending, f3, we don't actually have to touch this knight. This knight can instead retreat to e6. F captures e4, knight captures on c7, and you should probably get rid of one of these pawns, so e captures d5, knight captures d5. f4 comes next, and white is struggling to defend this attack. You can't get away with not taking the pawn, unfortunately. After a move like knight to f3, yes, you can take this way, e d4, knight d4, bishop captures on c5. The problem is here that if b4, which is a move that will come up later in the game, here the bishop is completely free to retreat back to b6. This bishop has nowhere to go, you have to trade here. This knight has the option of coming into c4 at some point, and I think it's safe to say that white has basically zero compensation for this pawn. Instead of e5, Bird played the move rook to f7, and the question becomes what happens in the case of f3, which is what Lasker played. Amos Byrne recommended simply retreating this knight back to f6, which is a very sensible move. But Bird instead played on move 19, so I'm not sure how much time he had to calculate this. Knight e captures on c5, sacrificing a piece. After d captures c5, bishop captures c5 check. This is move 20, so the players have reached the time control, but there's only one move that Lasker can reasonably play, so let's just go through that. e3. So this, I think, is the position we should be analyzing, and the question is, how does black continue this attack? The next recommendation of Amos Byrne is to create a retreat square for this bishop with a5, so that after, say, knight to d3, this bishop can remain on the long diagonal on a7. Now, after a very nice move, knight to e5, here I believe a very bird-coded move would be f4, sacrificing a full rook. You can play knight captures on f7, but first f captures on e3. White has to be careful not to allow e2 check, so this queen has to blockade on e2, and now this queen can take on f7. So black has sacrificed a rook, they have 3 pawns in exchange, and these pawns are running down the board. Moves like d4 and e5 come next, and black certainly has an attack here. Instead of that, Bird played, I think, a little too eagerly and immediately played the move f4. And the problem is here is that this does not let the attack keep much steam, because Lasker plays the move that I said we had earlier, b4. And now Byrne's point about creating an escape square for the bishop is very poignant. Any retreat here just allows us to take twice on f4, e captures f4, g captures f4, and now this bishop returns to the f4 square. White is just up a clean piece and is completely winning. So Bird is forced to sacrifice on e3. Bishop captures on e3 with check, knight captures on e3, and f captures e3. So the material is technically even. Bird has 3 pawns in exchange for the bishop, but it's obviously not enough. These central pawns are very vulnerable, the g pawn is isolated, and Bird still needs multiple moves to develop his queenside. This is, I would say, a complete disaster and a complete success for Lasker. Lasker played the solidifying move g4, kicking the queen back to h6, and now very simply queen to d3. There is no way for black to feasibly defend the e3 pawn, so Bird just has to expand as quickly as possible. He plays e5, and after queen captures on e3, e4 even. Now, after Lasker's move of bishop to d8, very simply going after the g-pawn, trying to look for a move for black here, knight to e5 is the closest thing that black has to a chance. Yes, bishop captures on g5 is a move, and after queen to g6, you really just have to hope as black here that white plays a slow move, like for example rook a to c1, perhaps trying to break open this pawn chain with a move like b5. Black has access to the very nice tactic bishop captures on g4. F captures g4, knight captures g4, and the problem is this queen has to keep defending the bishop, but you don't want to go back to the second rank because rook to f2 comes. So white has to try something like queen to g3, where after queen captures g5, bishop to h3 seems to pin the knight, and almost win it, but black is just in time to play queen to e3 check, trading the queens. This position is the same material imbalance of 3 pawns in exchange for the bishop, but these are much stronger pawns than before. They're all connected, 2 of them are passed, and I would say that black actually has very reasonable chances of winning this endgame. Instead of this, Bird tried to defend his pawn with knight to f6, but this just allows a trade. Bishop captures f6, rook captures f6, and now rook to d4. Lasker places a whole bunch of pressure on these central pawns and prepares to snap them up. So Bird has to try attacking on the h-file. He goes queen to h4, and after rook to a2, rook to h6, but Lasker plays rook to f2. So now whenever he takes on e4 with his pawn, the f-file opens up and he can go on an attack on Bird's exposed king. Now the problem with Bird's position is that he doesn't really have an attack on the king. You can give 1 check on h2, and after king to f1, there are no more usable checks that black can make, and the problem is that white is threatening to take on g5 with check. So you have to go back and defend the pawn with something like queen to e5, but now f captures on e4. Again, the f-file opens up. Both the f3 and d3 squares are available for white's knight to kick the queen further, and black's problems are just continuing, never ending. So Bird tries bishop to d7, and after f captures on e4, sacrifices his final extra pawn with c5. On rook captures d5, Lasker has made up the pawn deficit, so Bird has to try something. He plays queen to h2 check, and after king to f1, his plan is revealed. He now gets access to bishop to b5 check. The problem here is that Lasker simply blocks with knight to d3, and again, there are no more functionable checks. You can take here on d3, but that doesn't really do anything. And the problem is that Lasker is immediately threatening queen g5 check again. So Bird steps out of the way with king to h8, but if you have to play reactive moves like this, it's all over anyway. Lasker took on c5. This bishop has nowhere useful to go, so Bird traded. Bishop captures d3 with check, queen captures d3, and after rook to d6, here Lasker gave queen to c3 check, and the problem is that not only is Bird still down a piece, but his king is actually getting checkmated here. And so it was here on move 38 that Henry Edward Bird resigned the game, and with it, the match. So yeah, something of an anticlimactic final game. This sacrifice here on c5 could have been interesting had Bird calculated a little bit further that after e3 he could not just continue on the attack with f4 and he instead had to make some sort of preparatory move like a5. If he had and we would have had that super unbalanced position, then maybe this would have been an actually really interesting game. The soundness of the sacrifice could be debated, but it certainly would have made more of an objective mark than what he played in the game. But as it stands, Bird simply lost a piece, and the game didn't take much longer after that. So the question is, just how impressive is Lasker's 7-2 victory? Obviously, in itself, beating anyone that's considered an established master by such a wide margin is quite an achievement, but how does this compare to some of his contemporaries? Well, Bird hadn't played a serious match in a few years. I found a couple from 1886, and I think it's safe to say that at 60 years old, Bird probably hasn't learned that much more about chess in those 3 or 4 years. At the start of 1886, he played a match against Amos Byrne and tied him 9-9, though it should be noted that this was Byrne's first serious event after a very long hiatus in chess, so he was certainly not at his peak powers. Later in 1886, Bird played another match against Isidor Gunsberg, and Gunsberg won 5-1. So Lasker at some point in the match was up 6-0, which is a bigger margin. So it's safe to say that this was, by quite a few metrics, a very impressive match result. So at long last, we have finished our coverage of Lasker's first successful campaign in England. Next time, we'll be moving on to something completely different. The story continues. I look forward to seeing you there. So until then.